Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about Descartes. We're going to talk about his philosophy, his contributions to mathematics and science, and we're going to talk especially about his epistemology, including his Discourse on Methods and his Meditations. These are his two significant works, and we will talk a little bit about how they've influenced the field of philosophy over time and how we still struggle with some of their problems today. These are the things we're going to cover. You might notice on the slide we've got a little humorous comic, and we had one on the last slide as well. Those are from Existential Comics, or a web series showing humorous philosophical comics. This one right here is showing Skeptaholics Anonymous, because Descartes, his method of analysis, relies on radical skepticism. That is the doubting of everything that you can possibly doubt. Descartes, as far as his thinking, belongs to a school called rationalism. That's the idea that beliefs have to be justified by intellect, not just by experience. It's not enough to say that you know something is true because you can see it. You also have to be able to rationally argue why it's true. So a little bit about Descartes in particular. He was a French philosopher, and at this time, this is something we got to remember. Whereas today, academia is really narrowly split into these silos, back in Descartes' time, it wasn't. So he worked on mathematics, he worked on natural science, he worked on philosophy. Early in his life, he served in both Dutch and Bavarian armies. His work on geometry is probably his most famous, the Cartesian coordinate system. You all remember high school geometry. Plotting things out on the X, Y, using sine and cosine to figure all that out. That was Descartes. So if you hated your time in high school geometry, you have Descartes to thank for that. He created the sine law of refraction that explains prisms and rainbows. He is also, and this is one of the things I think is really interesting, one of the early creators of this idea that, all the planets started out as balls of just gas and material floating around the sun, and that over time, while orbiting, they became, planets. Now, that isn't something he published during his life. That was published after his death. It was something that he had written about, though. So very, very interesting. In his account of the universe, it's really similar to our modern account, where we've got a certain periodic table of elements and we've got some universal laws that govern them. And Descartes was one of the first people to really solidify that idea. So, as we can see, Descartes was a bit of an intellectual giant of his time, and he was one of those people that, when they encountered a problem, they tried to resolve it and they tried to find a solution to it. So that was really keeping in line with the scholastic tradition, the medieval tradition of monks studying the universe. And we see Descartes, a lot of people call him the first modern philosopher. Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, refers to him as first modern philosopher as well. But I find him to be a bit more of a scholastic myself. That is, continuing to some extent with the tradition of the medieval monks, because all his work was predicated on proving the existence of God and the existence of the soul. He was really working to further the teachings of the Catholic Church. And, not that that's a bad thing, but that is kind of the goal of the scholastic tradition. Now, the scholastic tradition was working from an Aristotelian playbook, whereas Descartes wanted to try and move away from that and use a different sort of background rather than the Aristotelian background. So his Discourse on the Method, and this is one of his more famous works, and this is where he describes his method of analysis. This is where he describes his goal for what he's trying to do. It is a rather dry read, very hard to read. Now, Descartes is one of those philosophers that you will really either enjoy his reading or you won't. Myself, I can't stand to read Descartes. I don't know what it is about his writing style, but it kind of makes me think of those recipe blogs that you go, maybe you're looking up a potato salad recipe. You find a good looking recipe, and then you have to read through like 9 paragraphs of text before you actually learn how to make the potato salad. And that's how a lot of Descartes' writing feels to me. So in Discourse on the Method, he's describing his method for the meditations, and he lays it out in 4 ways. It's meant to mimic the ways that geometers, people who do geometry would do, which is avoid hasty judgment, divide large problems into small problems, start with the simplest ideas, and then from those simple ideas, enumerate ideas completely. So go through very methodically, very slowly. For a geometer, it might be something to the effect of you start with, I've got 3 points with lines connecting them. The total the total sum of the angles is 180. Because of these, I can conclude it's a triangle. I can conclude that the cosine function will work on it because of X and Y and Z, So that is the geometer method, and that is what Descartes is talking about with that. It makes his works a bit hard. I find them a bit hard to read, but there are a lot of people that love Descartes. They say he's approachable and easy to read. You just have to read him yourself and see what you think. See if you think he's enjoyable or if he's tedious. Descartes' method is known as radical skepticism. So starting with that really simple question, what do I really know? You start by doubting everything that you can possibly doubt. Think of anything you could doubt. So at one point he doubts he can see anything clearly because, there have been times that he's had his vision tricked. He doubts that, perhaps he's actually sitting in his room because he's had dreams that he's in other places, right? And he keeps doubting and keep doubting until he gets to the point where he says, okay, I can't doubt that I exist because I have these thoughts, and to have these thoughts, I have to exist. His goal with this radical skepticism was to put philosophy on the same footing as mathematics and science. Again, with that method of doubting everything until he found something that he could not doubt anymore. And from that thing he could not doubt, he would build out a whole new theory of life and the universe based on that single point of knowledge, right? So he starts with that one point of knowledge and builds a whole new existence de novo from nothing, based on that one idea. So in Descartes' Meditations, depending on the translation you are reading, it will include a copy of a letter that he sent to the College of Sacred Theology in Paris, where he described the goals of the meditation as to prove the existence of God and the soul via reason. His argument was that, an unbeliever can't be converted to the truth faith if they don't have a rational argument to fall on. So that was his goal. And I'm using the Hackett translation, and it does include the letter. So I thought that I would bring that up because it is kind of an important thing to keep in mind. Descartes wasn't going into his quest as an atheist. He wasn't going into his quest as someone with no spiritual background. He was going into his quest as a Catholic, hoping to advance the teachings of the Catholic Church. So I'm going to walk through each of the meditations. He starts out with his first meditation where he kind of explains his extreme skepticism. He explains his method of doubting everything and doubting that the world he is in exists, doubting his memories, doubting his vision. Then in the second meditation, after he does all that doubting, he eventually determines that he must exist, and that his soul must be immaterial and immortal, because he knows that he's got a material body. Material bodies decay, but his mind, this thinking thing that he has, is immaterial, so it must be the opposite of the material body. In the third meditation, he starts his arguments for the existence of God. In the fourth, he argues that clear and distinct perceptions must be true. So, God's not evil. God wouldn't place you here and give you these wild hallucinations of things that aren't true. So those must be true. He eventually presents an additional argument for God, and then he presents the difference between knowledge and imagination and proves the mind and body must be separate. It's a lot here, and in the 50 or 60 pages or so that it takes for him to do the meditations, he covers a lot of ground. So as you read through it, you got to keep in mind that he's moving at a quick pace, even though his writing style is rather tedious about that. So we'll dig a little bit more into that mind-body dualism. And we got to understand with this mind-body dualism, this idea that the body and the immortal soul are different, are not new ideas. It goes all the way back to Plato. Plato gives an argument for the existence of the soul and the immortality of the soul in the Timaeus, I believe. So we do see that there are, historical arguments for this, but Descartes does it in a new way. He does it from this geometric way, which does present a different kind of argument. Towards the end of his life, Descartes argues that the mind and body interface through the pineal gland. That's just one of those artifacts of the time. He argued that from conceivability, that you can imagine your mind existing separately from your body, so therefore it must exist separately from your body. And he argued that because you can imagine a perfect thing and an immortal thing, that God must exist as a perfect thing, God must exist as an immortal thing. Because your mind is not material, it must exist separately from the body. He argued that something that lacked a mind was just an automaton. So part of Socrates' argument is that the world exists via natural laws and material things can be predetermined. So a body without a soul or an animal will just function similar to an automata, similar to a robot. They'll follow the natural laws and they'll just work through the natural laws until they eventually decease. In modern times, we'd think of that argument as, basically like a supercomputer argument, that if you had a computer powerful enough to calculate the movements of every atom, that you could determine what a creature was going to do from the time it was born till the time it was going to die. Of course, that brings up the mind-body problem. If the mind and body are different, how do they interact? One idea that is very popular in the time of Descartes was presented by Gulinx, and Bertrand Russell talks about this, which is that the mind and body are like two perfectly synced clocks set in motion by God. So if you hear one clock chime and then look at the other, they'll be perfectly in sync. So that's one kind of answer to the question. Another one is the materialistic answer, arguing that the mind is a physical object, not arguing that the mind is immortal, but perhaps going through that same process as Descartes and coming to the other end and saying that the mind is just a physical object, that it exists in the world. And then functionalism argues that mental events are just brain functions and that the mind is a manifestation of the brain. And that's probably the most current definition when people think about the mind and the soul. Most modern people think from a bit of a functionalist perspective, because our understanding of the brain and brain function has grown and changed a lot over the years. But with all that being said, there is still a lot of unknowns about the way the mind and the body interact. We obviously know that it has something to do with the brain, and we know that has something to do with mental states changing over time, but it is still a bit of an unsolved question as to how exactly it is a person keeps a mental continuity throughout their life, and how it is that, a person can say lose half their brain, as there have been many famous cases, but still function pretty much exactly the same as they did before. Whereas if the mind were merely a matter of brain function, then a person losing half their brain or, having to have a significant portion of their brain removed due to cancer would seem to be functionally a different person. So where does that fall in there? It's still an open debate, and it's one of those things that I think Descartes, better than a lot of other philosophers, really gets people thinking about the way that the mind and body interact than many others. So that's all I've got. A rather short video today. If you made it all the way to the end, I appreciate you sticking with it. If you are a student in my class, I look forward to hearing from you during the weekly lectures or on the forums. If you are someone who found this on YouTube, give me a like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.